Hello and welcome back to the Ladies Wrestling Grill podcast. It is really good to be back. Um, I took an unintentional hiatus for the month of April. There has just been so much that has been happening in women's wrestling that I really need to take some time to absorb. Um, what was the aftermath of WrestleMania? What was going on after all of these great matches from many companies around the world after the WrestleMania weekend, because we know that weekend has like five-star um, shows from promotions that all gather into the state and city that WrestleMania takes place. So honestly, I've been catching up on all of those different promotions and what they did in that week and what was the aftermath of those great matches at the beginning of April, and just kind of seeing where wrestling is after that, because a lot of changes happen. A lot of people feel like they need to elevate their game or kind of change up what they're doing after WrestleMania, even when they're not in WWE. A lot of surprise debuts or things happen even outside of WWE during that time. So it was a lot to take in over these past few weeks. I kind of wanted to also go back to the mainframe, the foundation of what the Ladies Wrestling Grill podcast is about. And that is usually about making sure that I am talking about unappreciated storylines, feuds, and women in wrestling from the past. Yes, I cover the present too, and what I kind of see from some great talent or storylines that will be happening in the future. So, as I've been observing everything that has been happening over this past month in women's wrestling specifically, something really caught my eye and I liked, but there's some things that I feel is still a miss for me with this subject matter in WWE. And a lot of people have been talking about how they either liked or they didn't like Trish Stratus's heel turn. And I have to say that I am a big fan of Trish deciding to come back and come back in this capacity. I think that there have been examples of the past of Trish kind of dipping her toe into being a heel, especially when she first came to WWE in 2000. She was really trying to pull off a character that I feel that she had the smarts for, so she really knew how to make her character come off as someone that was calculated in what she was doing and how she had an end game to things that she was doing. And I think that she's kind of bringing that back, especially with the promo that she had after she attacked Becky Lynch. You can see that she was making it clear this was something that she was thinking about for a while, because she felt like there was a huge lack of disrespect for what the ruthless aggression golden era of women's wrestling in WWE contributed. But she's specifically upset for her not getting that type of recognition from Becky Lynch, that Becky was mostly paying that type of homage to Lita. And I thought, especially this week, what the interview that Trish did for After the Bell. There's so many podcasts, so sometimes I forget the names of it, but WWE's podcast that they have with Corey Graves being the host of it, talking about, and she was taking on, making sure that she was keeping with the heel persona throughout the entire interview, how she felt. And I think she's absolutely correct in that she had to go through hearing the puppies chants to get to the point where people were actually applauding her matches and not carrying on with the same type of tropes of only wanting to see women provide TNA for them, no pun intended. So she was absolutely right about that her generation did have to go through that so that we can have the "this is awesome" chants that we usually hear in women's matches in WWE today. Now, I completely agreed with Trisha's stance on what she helped to contribute to have these type of experiences now for women's wrestling fans to enjoy the wrestling without having all those other things that, frankly, obviously, as a long fan, a lifelong fan of wrestling, specifically being a fan of WWE since I was a kid, I remember those days very clearly. So we did have to get through that phase to get to where we are now, where we can enjoy it in a way that was not so prevalent before. Now, the part where I disagree with Trish, and it's not anything actually towards Trish that I have like any the problem that I have is the comments that Trish made about feeling like she was the only factor that played into why that change happened, from fans going from chanting "We want puppies" to them really caring about the women's matches, with those matches not being bathroom breaks for the fans. I completely disagree with that. And I think that what I'm going to be discussing here is fully on management and the overall structure of who gets to succeed in WWE. So with I feel with Trish having that point of view, because even though she's a heel and she's really laying into that, which is really cool, there was, in my opinion, an absolute confidence and Trish feeling that that factor was true, where she was saying she's the best women's wrestler that came out of WWE. As much as I like Trish, I love seeing the transition that Trish made from being a valet, being a manager, that sadly no one really had that much confidence in that she could make that turn into being a wrestler. It wasn't really even anything that anyone put into account when Trish first came, because at that time, and you saw this with several women even before Trish came in, the overall structure of who were the women that were really going to be pushed as the ultimate woman in WWE happened to have the blueprint of something that was prevalent also in Hollywood, which is that everyone wanted their version of Pamela Anderson. And clearly we know that because even Trish commented on that when she would do interviews before she went to WWE, that she knew, especially with her being a fitness model before, that a lot of people felt like she favored Pamela Anderson, or she had that particular look to her that can make her successful in WWE. So Trish knew that. And when she first came in, she did lean into that. So that's why most people didn't feel that her character would go past anything other than that. Now, Trish could have certainly had the desire to do that. Before she came to WWE, she was interested in wrestling. She even received training beforehand. So it was a personal desire of hers. And I'm pretty sure she can vocalize that. But when she first came in, WWE solely wanted her for her looks, and they wanted her to be more of a manager. So you had that same thing with Sable. She became the ultimate, the top woman in WWE because of her looks, because she could literally follow the same moniker as Pamela Anderson by being a Playboy cover model, which did happen, and you can get that type of cross promotion and attention toward what WWE was doing by having someone as Sable kind of represent that bombshell that they wanted in the company. And then even before that, a few years before, you had the same type of look with Sunny, where she was starting to dominate how many views that pictures can get online, when she became the most downloaded woman in the world, not even just in WWE. When AOL, some people, especially now, may not even know about AOL, but she was the most downloaded woman on AOL. I believe it was in 1996. So you see the same model that was going on for maybe about 4, close to 5 years with WWE, that you would have a sprinkling of other women in the company, but the women that were really getting pushed, that were getting merchandise, that were going on talk shows, that was really getting that big okay that they are the top women in the company, happen to have the same look and happen to have the same type of positioning in the company, not really getting taken seriously as wrestlers, because they were not brought in for that. Now, in Sunny's defense, and I kind of wish sometimes people would go back to this, not everyone that enters wrestling wants to be a wrestler. And many times they are very good at being managers. They're not managers just because they're someone's boyfriend or husband in the business. They actually have a talent for it. And obviously, despite how a lot of opinions have changed, obviously, about Sunny, one thing we can say is that she was very good at being a manager. With Sable, it really was the not the first time, but it was one of the biggest examples of someone that was coming in. They fully knew why they were coming in to the company, and they completely laid into the fact that she is not a wrestler. She's going to be our very own pinup girl that we have that happens to hold the title and can advertise the hell out of WWE outside of the company and really get that other attention from other platforms on there. And I think initially when Trish came in, she was supposed to be that next era parent to be able to push that look and even bring in the moniker of diva. And I know that there has been a lot of arguments from some women that started in WWE before Trish or before Sable that said that they were technically the original divas. But the reason why I'm going to put that more so on Trish is because once Trish came in, even after Sable, I feel like that's when they really started to push that these were not wrestlers, these were divas, because they really started to lay into that. The term started to be used more whenever the women would come out, whether it was on commentary or having the divas photo shoots. They really started to push for that being a thing that you call the women in WWE. You don't call them wrestlers, you call them divas. So Trish was really at the head of that. And just like I said, I feel that all along, just like Trish stated in this last interview that she had, that she always had in her mind that she had to do certain things in order to get to the point where she could be taken seriously as a wrestler. The point of contention that I have is that in these conversations, or even when they bring back women from the past, there's usually only 3 women that they bring back. And over time, that's going to do a lot of damage because as you keep going by with the years, a lot of the efforts from women's wrestlers, I mean, real women's wrestlers that really put in the time to hone in their craft, to become masters at it, they're usually never brought into these conversations. They're never really honored like that. At the most, they might get 2 minutes in a Royal Rumble match, and then you don't hear about them again. But constantly, we have had to hear about the contributions that Trish and Lita made. And this is coming from someone that is a fan of both Trish and Lita. When I was growing up, I was more of a fan of Lita. But we constantly keep hearing just about the 2 of them as if they were the only women in WWE, especially during that golden era time. The reason why that is a gripe for me is because I feel, and I'm just going to be honest, the reason why Trish looked that good is because she had women that were in-ring generals that were making her look that good. That doesn't mean that Trish didn't put in the work. That doesn't mean that she didn't deeply care about the evolution of the women's division, because truly you can see that she did. But at that time, we're talking about 2001 to about 2004, Trish still had a lot of training to go through. She still really had to improve on her wrestling. And there were women that already had sometimes maybe even decades worth of experience that were really making those matches look good, that really helped with these storylines, because at that time we started to get storylines with women that were worthwhile. And it still wasn't perfect, but it was miles away from that weird phase that we were in that was very Jerry Springerish during 1998 to 2001, where you weren't really getting any storylines. If they were really weird, and obviously they were just there to eventually lead to someone getting their clothes ripped off. So during the golden age that I would probably fit into the Ruthless Aggression era, you started getting storylines on Raw specifically for the women along with matches that started to get more time. Still wasn't perfect, but you started to get more of what someone who was a fan of women's wrestling wanted. So, this introduction was made so that I can, on the Ladies Wrestling Grill podcast, talk about the women that I feel made huge accomplishments to help develop and reinvigorate a women's division during the Attitude Era, where it definitely was not the easiest to do. The reason why I'm doing this is because, as much as I love Trish's heel turn, I feel like, especially because we know a lot of these women will not be brought back in any capacity. I would be extremely shocked if that happened. They're not going to get that type of attention or respect really for what they did during that time, where they were taking little bits of TV time to really make something out of it. So I want to get into it. I know that this was also, I believe, mentioned during Trisha's latest interview, where she was saying, like, what do we really have before I came along? You had China, and then, before that you kind of have Wendy Richter. And I think that there's a big chunk of history that is really being removed, and I think it's pretty fucked up to just leave that out of there, because there were women that were trying a lot to bring some more attention to women's wrestling on an American level. Outside of America, you had promotions for women, literally made for women, that were leaps and bounds ahead of what was going on here, even to the point where they were still leaps and bounds ahead, even when we had that golden era on the indie scene for women's wrestling in the mid 2000s. Even then, they were still ahead of what we're doing. So a lot of women that were traveling overseas was trying to bring that type of wrestling to America. And I think after you had, it seemed like an inkling that Vince did want to have a women's division in the late 80s, mid to late 80s in WWE. After he screwed over Wendy Richter, he was still trying to keep some type of division, but not really. It wasn't his biggest priority. And I think that was sad, because you had a lot of women that were Joshi wrestlers that I think brought a lot of attention to women's wrestling when they would come to WWE for those stints. That was pretty much forgotten about. And then you kind of had like a glimmer of hope in 92, toward like early 93, with Luna Vachon and Sherry Martel, when they had a brilliant but very, very short-lived feud that I think could have really pumped some energy into what the women's division in the early 90s could have been. You see, all of a sudden, with both Luna and Sherry really just being used in a manager's capacity, that they still had a lot that they could have done as wrestlers in WWE. And you see Luna kind of, really laying into her role as a heel, which I think, honestly, she is one of the top for me when it comes to fully embracing a character, and you don't know where Luna Vachon ends and where her real life persona began. It was just really merged together. And I think that she was really trying to show that in WWE. And she had a great counterpart with Sherry Martel, who I feel probably many times was itching to have some type of semblance of a women's division in WWE. She had done a brilliant job managing for many years in WWE at that point. But I think that there was a glimmer of hope that she could start wrestling again. And I think that these two women were just brilliant to work together. With Luna making her WWE debut at WrestleMania 10, at WrestleMania 9 in Las Vegas, you kind of, felt like something can come out of it, not just her being a manager. I felt like they were trying to let the signal out that maybe they were going to try to bring more women in. Now, we know in America in the 90s, there weren't that many female wrestlers that they could pull from. But if they would have just started with Sherry and Luna, especially because at that time there was more of a tolerance to seeing storylines play out sometimes for up to a year, especially if you just continuously had great additions to those feuds, then no one would care about the fact that it lasts long. Now you have to get rid of your title like in 2 months. Before people start feeling like it's tired. But I think that they really could have had a good feud until they started to pick other women, possibly from different countries, that they could bring in to add to it. But this feud that Luna and Sherry had, they were just beating the tar out of each other and really making it clear they wanted to rip each other apart and really not holding back. And fighting as hard as the guys, I think that this would have been a great time to build up the division. In Vince McMahon's defense, I think that he actually was trying, but shortly after this feud started, Sherry Martel was let go because of some issues with drug use. Now, the reason why this does piss me off when I saw or many different shoot interviews where Sherry was talking about why she was let go by WWE. When you look back now, I guess at the time, especially with the steroid scandal that I believe started to begin at that time, there were so many male wrestlers that were doing worse things, but they were never released. Sherry Martel was smoking marijuana and she was let go from WWE while she was in the midst of this feud. And I think that it was so sad because they were really building something good. Bam Bam Bigelow was involved in it because Luna was also managing Bam Bam, which to me was one of the best pairings that they had in the 90's, was Luna Vachon and Bam Bam Bigelow, which I will talk about in another separate solo Luna Vachon episode of the podcast. And then you had Sherry with Tatanka, which I thought was a really good pairing as well. And we didn't see that follow up. I think that that could have also been the beginning of WWE really leaning into intergendered tag team matches, which it seemed like they were doing. And that could have been another addition to WWE that could have been ahead of its time. But Sherry was let go, so all of those plans just stopped. So we have that early 90's rumbling of a women's division kind of budding, but as soon as it began, it quickly ended. We have a few years, maybe I would say close to 2.5 years, where we don't see any women's wrestling. And then we have someone that was not in WWE for a long time, but made a huge impact for the women's wrestling division, and that is Alundra Blaze. Alundra was literally brought in to create a division. She was asked who she would like to wrestle with, who she think could really help to build up a women's division. And we know at this time, by this time, this was around 94, 95, Alundra had already wrestled and really made a name for herself in Japan. Before that, many different territories like AWA, she had already had a stint, a very successful stint in WCW. So she had already had a name for herself. So they knew that if they brought in Alundra into WWE, you wouldn't have to do this huge introduction of her because the fans would have been familiar. But even then, they really put some money behind really building up Alundra Blaze, who she was and what she was going to do. I mean, the vignettes, the close-up interviews where they really took time to build up Alundra was really exciting to see. And then not only that, they knew they had to go back to the source to have really great women's wrestling. And this was definitely from the opinion of Alundra Blaze that she really needed to wrestle again with some familiar dance partners, with women from All Japan Wrestling that she knew that she could really make some magic with in the ring, and really help to continue on with some great feuds that Japanese wrestlers had already had the pleasure of seeing. And that, of course, being her feud with Bull Nakano, that to this day is literally one of the best feuds ever, regardless of it being two women in the ring, just one of the best feuds. So we're able to see at that time Alundra Blaze perform not only on WWE TV, but also have that feud go on in Japan when Bull Nakano and Alundra Blaze fought at the big Egg Wrestling Universe event, which is one of the best women's wrestling pay-per-views that has ever happened. And you saw that cross promotion where WWE was showing the results of those wrestling events that Alundra had the pleasure of performing at overseas. So it really brought into play, and I love that this happened at this time, by the way, that Alundra was really a world women's champion. She was defending that title around the world. And then you had someone like Bret Hart too that had that same mantra that he was a world champion. So I love that that was happening at the same time because it was really putting, and I think really helped WWE to stand out at the time that they had world champions. That was really showing the pairings that they've had around the world. And I think that Alundra was the perfect wrestler to do that because there was zero fear about her feeling that at any time she could be challenged and at any time she would defend that title. So I think that this is certainly a championship reign, no matter how long it was, that does deserve that respect because it wasn't just Alundra coming in to wrestle for the women's division, it was her developing a division within a span of a few months. And even then, having matches around the world that still hold up to this day as being some of the best matches in wrestling history. And really showing that not only was she super talented, but she cared about these legends that she wrestled as well, getting that attention on American soil. So I thought that that was very important that these things have to continue to be mentioned because many times this particular, I think in just in general, the new generation era in WWE is really forgotten. Yes, there were some things that sadly should be forgotten because they just were not good. But there were many things that were good during that time that really showed that there were a lot of workhorses in the company at that time, and they really cared about the integrity of holding certain titles. The Intercontinental title, to me, was represented so well during that time. The Women's Championship was represented so well at that time, and the heavyweight title. Tag team titles were really strong at that time as well. So I think that as much as we can talk about loving that golden era in WWE during the mid 2000s, this new generation's women's division should receive that same attention. Now, I think the difference between a female wrestler's ambitions and desires and goals to move forward cannot be judged by the rug being pulled from underneath them. And that was the fate that Alundra had, where she was really building up the women's division. And then all of a sudden, because of a lot of money that was lost during the steroids trial, the women's division was the first on the chopping block. And I think that that was insane, especially because, just like I said, there were a lot of things that should probably be forgotten too during that new generation's era. There were a lot of things that should have been cut from the male division. But of course, that doesn't happen. Usually, whenever they're making cuts in WWE, the women have to receive the brunt of it. And that's literally what happened, right? When I feel that Alundra was really hitting her stride, when they brought in Aja Kong to really take out Alundra Blaze, when they had Luna coming back to manage Aja Kong, and they were alluding to Luna probably having a feud with Medusa, that's when the women's division just ended and everyone was gone. And that's why I always have this question in my head of what if? What if that did not happen and Alundra could have held that title maybe 2, 3 years? Because just like I said, at that time, people did not mind their champions holding the title for that long if they had really great feuds. And I think that Alundra could have had that. Or even if the title changed hands, it still would have been awesome. I always think of what if because that really could have carried into the Attitude Era where people were really behind the women's division. They didn't see it as bathroom breaks because they didn't view those matches that Alundra Blaze was having like that. many times, if you look back at those videos, when Aja Kong would come out and people looked frightened because she was that much of a monster heel, or Bull Nakano or Luna, and then you had this really white hot baby face with Alundra Blaze, these people were insanely involved as fans in these matches. They would get sometimes the huge pops. And yes, they did not fight as much as the male wrestlers. Many times there were patches of time where you didn't see the women, but whenever you did, these matches were taken quite seriously. They didn't have to go through feeling that people didn't really see them as athletes because they were viewed as that. Um, oh yeah, and I have to mention Bertha Faye because I really cannot forget about her. She contributed a lot to this women's division as well. I really sometimes think back about what if they would have had more time? What if they could have really built the division? But just like I said, that's usually what happens with women's division. They'll hit a stride, especially during the 90s, and then all of a sudden they would just be cut or they would be mass firing for these women because it just wasn't a priority anymore. So you had the Luna Sherry feud that really could have pushed the bounds of what could have been done with women's wrestling in the early 90s. Then in that early to mid 90s, you had Alundra Blaze really trying to develop a women's division with the help of All Japan Wrestling, lending their top wrestlers to really build up this division. Then once again, as many women were laid off during this time, there's radio silence on whether you're going to see a women's division again for about 2 years. During that time, you had somewhat of a presence with women, but only in a valet or manager's capacity. Now, I don't think that Sunny's presence should be taken lightly because she did make a big impact. I personally think that she was a great manager. She had that thing that you need as a manager to really frame who you're managing. And I think that she had that. But that was really all of the presence that you saw for a while. And then you had Marlena, who I feel was the perfect manager for Goldust. And that was refreshing to see, but we still weren't getting that thrill from seeing women's wrestling done well. And then we have something that doesn't come along that much within a lifetime, and we had China as an enforcer. She was not a manager, she was an enforcer. And by that, I mean that it was the ticket, that insurance that someone like Triple H needed to, and Shawn Michaels, to really enforce the fact that they were not going to lose their titles, that they were something to be reckoned with, not because they were the wrecking ball, it was because China was. And to have someone like China, like you had never seen a woman do that before in WWE. And the reason why I said that in WWE, because just like I was mentioning, many times WWE likes painting the picture for the entire wrestling world about how things were done, and it's not true. Yes, in WWE, China was the first woman that was really taking it to guys. She wasn't the manager that you usually saw that would stand on the side. They would clap for the guys, but they would never actually attack a guy to his face. They might hit him behind the back, but never take it to them the way that China did. In WCW, Jacqueline was actually doing that, but she never gets any attention for that. So in WWE, China was certainly the first, and it made a huge impact on how women should be seen in WWE, where you could still have women that were doing more of the traditional managing. Certainly nothing wrong with that. But when you saw China, you knew that there was going to be a matter of time before she started wrestling. And it really wasn't even up for question that she was going to face the men, because it just made sense. There was no way that you're going to justify it, especially with the limited amount of women that they even showed on WWE programming at that time, because it was pretty much a desert for that. You didn't have any women really that were wrestling. So it was just a no-brainer that they were going to have China fully be a part of DX and really be that enforcer for DX, But when it was time for her to wrestle, she was definitely going to face the men. And I think that that brought such a great component because when you see outside of WWE, around 97, 98, 99, you did have women outside of the company that were trying to play the question, can some women be a part of facing men in intergender matches? Is that a thing that we're going to show in a serious light where this is actually going to be a respected bout between the man and the woman in the match? And I think that China just completely cracked that door open and made it very clear we don't need to debate it. I am worthy enough to fight the guys, and that will happen. And you will want to buy the pay-per-views because you want to see me do that. So as much as I love Trish as a heel, to kind of lightly graze over that, that was a huge part. And Vince McMahon sitting back and saying, we're going to certainly push China, but she's only going to fight the men at this time. But at that point, I think it played the question of should they bring back a full-on women's division? And I think that that certainly connected. And I think that that helped to bring back the women's division because Vince was very sour about the women's division, especially after what Alundra Blaze, Medusa at that point, again, in WCW did with the women's championship. So I don't think after that he really had any inkling to want to bring back a women's division. I think it was with the advent of what China did, with him seeing how Sable really had a meteoric rise and wanting to feel like she should have some gold on, because when Sable really started to get her push, she needed a dance partner, and that's when they brought in Jacqueline. And if you're going to have them feuding, there has to be something that they're fighting for outside of just being, the prettiest woman in WWE. They needed a title. And I think that China actually played a large part in them actually thinking about if they want a women's division, because then you kind of saw more of a female presence after that. And you started to have a variety of a female presence. You can have someone like China, who definitely was not there to get the guys off. But then you had someone like Sable, where she truly was the pinup. She was quintessentially the diva of the division. And then you had someone like Jacqueline that, to me, she was in the middle. She certainly had no problem showing sex appeal, but you better believe when she got in that ring, it was time to get your fight on with her, because you could not be a slouch in the ring with Jacqueline. And I want to go and dive into Jacqueline because when Sable needed to establish herself as someone that was that can justifiably hold the title, she needed to start to learn how to wrestle. And I think that Jacqueline was a great pairing for her. And I know that Jacqueline said that she liked her experience working with Sable, but Jacqueline had to be that in-ring general. And as I mentioned, Jacqueline had wrestled for a long time up until this point, and she had a lot of experience. And in WCW, she was essentially doing what China was trying to do in that time before she got to WWE, but she had to see China do it because she didn't get that huge push like China did. Jacqueline was coming out with Kevin Sullivan, attacking the guys. I mean, really laying it into them, but they didn't like it. They didn't want to push for that. Eric Bischoff certainly did not want to push a woman, especially of Jacqueline's stature. Jacqueline is, I think, maybe 5'2", beating up these guys like this who are supposed to look bigger than God, at that point in the ring. They did not want to push that. So she was essentially fired eventually because they knew that they couldn't do anything with her because she constantly had that goal of wanting to face guys. Because they certainly weren't going to create a women's division at that time in WCW. So when that happened, JR, who was new to booking talent at the time, he saw something in Jacqueline that he could possibly build up a women's division. But we know that Sable, of course, was going to hold the title for a bit. So having Jacqueline come at that time was actually a blessing for Sable because she really framed her to look like $100, like $1 million in these matches. So you had Jacqueline come in. Now you can finally start to build off with two women at first, with seeing how the women's division can go. They made huge ratings with their segments on Raw and in the pay-per-views. So I think that that just added like a thumbs up for Vince to feel like he can bring in more women during this 1998, 1999 time frame in WWE. Luna returned. She was first managing Goldust, but then she started getting added to the mix of the women's division, and she was another one that made Sable look amazing in the ring. They had very memorable matches. Then Luna was able to, on some of the other shows like Heat, and then later on Metal, they kind of had that was pretty much like their show for people that weren't on that high on the card to still have some great matches. Luna was doing her thing on those matches. She was really showing, and I feel she was like at the best physically on the mic as she could have been. And I was happy to see her, but they really could have gone harder with pushing Luna at this time because she was just money at this time. And I think that that really helped to solidify that they were trying to take the women's division seriously, but they were still not getting huge amounts of time. So they were making the best with what they had. And just like I stated earlier, just like with the new generation era, when you had women like Luna, when you had women like Jacqueline wrestling, the fans were hip enough to know this is not a segment where Sable's coming out and revealing lingerie. This is actually a full-on match. And they were into the match. So I think that WWE had moments in the show where clearly they were trying to appeal to the college audience, but then there were moments where they're like, look, this is an actual match, so you need to take it seriously like that. And it seemed like there were times where the fans really did get that, and they were fully into what these women were doing athletically. Then shortly after that time, you had Ivory, who I am just so tired of not really hearing her contributions to this particular time in the Attitude Era. We talked about, especially when Ivory held the title 3 times. She had 3 different reigns, all of them really good, and she's never fully mentioned in this time. She came in, Ivory had experience from Glow, but I think she definitely took it further and really showed that she wanted to be seen as a stronger wrestler during her time coming into WWE. Just like I mentioned with Jacqueline, Ivory fully understood this is entertainment industry, so clearly she understood that her look mattered, but her wrestling mattered to her more. And as much as I love when Trish was saying, we're really pushing for, women's wrestling during that time, which is not false during her early reign, Ivory was actually pushing for that a hell of a lot more during that time. And many times being told to, just shut up and do your job. But even then, when she was in the ring, she really wanted to prove that she stood out as a wrestler. And to me, Ivory had more of a versatile style than a lot of women on the division. And I think that that really does need to be highlighted. I think that's why she became a really good trainer when WWE really started pushing for Tough Enough. I think that that really made her a great manager because she just has such great skills in the ring. But not only that, I feel like Ivory was one of the strongest talkers. She was very good at creating different types of characters, but also really entertaining for a fan, whether she was a heel or a babyface. So I really hope that people will go back to look at her catalog, because even with her starting off with women winning her in her first reign, the women's championship in June 14th, 1999, she really helped to build up, I think, in that late 90s time toward the summer of 1999 when she started feuding with Tori. Now, Tori is another one that does not get mentioned because usually everyone's talking about Tori Wilson. But Tori, before Tori Wilson, who came in initially as someone who was stalking Sable, quickly showed that she was going to be a great hand in showing what the women could do in this 1999 2000 year, that they could really pull off some great matches. And many times they would have like 5 minutes, maybe four. And that was also including the entrance of these wrestlers. They would still pull off these amazing matches. And I feel that Ivory and Tori had amazing chemistry really early on. When Tori came in, Ivory and Tori really started to collide with each other, and their match at SummerSlam was a great indicator of that. But then after that, on September 6th of 1999, Tori and Ivory, to me, had one of the best hardcore matches in WWE, even to this day, that usually doesn't get talked about as much as the cage match that I believe Lita and Ivory had. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but I do think that they both should be talked about just the same, because they really brought a perspective to the fans that these women could actually be a part of these specialty matches as well, when feuds had gotten to a point where they had to end it all. This had to be the last match that ended this feud and solidified who was the toughest out of the two. I think that this hardcore match between Ivory and Tori certainly did that. I also really liked the early iteration of Tori's character, because at that time, just like we discussed, sometimes you would have women that were just like extremely sexual for no reason at all. And I felt that Tori just had this natural femininity that really pushed what we saw at that time, where a lot of people were really pushing the Zen, calm, peaceful approach to life. And I think that Tori really exuded that. She really exuded that, what I would consider, and you saw this like in the 80s too, where you would have more the aerobics girl, the one that was totally all about fitness. I think that Tori was that, where you would just have those chill characters that were really great in the ring, but they weren't trying to push on any type of sexuality. And I think that Tori was very good at that. Once again, this was the early iteration. After they kind of decided that some women needed to push more their sexuality, as we saw when Tori was involved with X-Pac and DX. It wasn't that I wasn't a fan of that. I just really liked how her character was when she was really going for the women's title. So I think that Ivory, Tori definitely need to be involved more in those conversations about great title reigns in WWE during the Attitude Era. So I think that Luna and Jacqueline's what they should be known for during that time is that they were holding down the fort for the women's division to show that you could be super athletic and have more of a brawler style, that even the men backstage would garner a lot of respect for you for being able to pull that off, because a lot of their partners and the men backstage would probably be, I mean, like style wise, if we're looking at Jacqueline and Luna, would kind of be like what the APA were at the time, where men really loved seeing Bradshaw and Farouk have that really rough, strong, I would say like wrestling style that everyone really liked. I feel like Luna and Jacqueline had that, and it was really great to see them collide. Even sometimes it looked like they were actually having shoot like matches, because they even started pissing off each other in the ring a little bit because of how rough they were being with each other. I think that they really had that type of niche in the women's division, that they were going to bring you that brawler style while still being super athletic, because there were many times that Jacqueline brought in her martial arts background into matches, and it was really awesome to see. So this whole thing, this whole breakdown of the role that many women's wrestlers played in the 90s is because I think that many times WWE paints a different picture depending on who they're okay with at the time, that causes fans that are watching at that time who may not have been born at that time, or as we know, especially with how many things happen in WWE because there's never off season, it's very easy to forget certain people's contributions. And I want Trish to keep going on with this character, this heel turn, because it can reap a lot of benefits, like really trying to revitalize the women's division in WWE. But because, just like I said, I don't see down the road Trish making certain comments and then some of those women coming back to, talk about what they feel they contributed. I think that it's certainly our duty as women's wrestling fans to talk about those key things that a lot of women during the 90's, with the little bit of support that they were actually getting to put on matches, to actually be a part of the tapestry of WWE at the time, they did a whole lot with very little. And if we thought that the golden era of women's wrestling had insulting chants or degrading storylines, these women that were definitely there doing that middle part of the end of the 90's, where they had to hear and be a part of things that were really degrading, for them to still put on the matches that they did, to take wrestling really seriously at the time and really push for it, with possibly having the stigma of trying to bring drama because they're just trying to push for their art to be taken seriously, is a big deal. It did not just start in 2001. This was a fight that many women in WWE were trying to push for before that. So I hope that this episode really conveys that, because these women truly deserve that respect. So with that, that is the end of this podcast episode. I truly hope that you appreciate it. And as we move into this next week, which would be the beginning of May, there are some great things ahead. I have really been taking the time out this month to think about and really lay out some really great episodes that dive a bit more into the history of wrestling for different promotions, so that we can mix it up and have some fresh perspectives on different things. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this stirs up a conversation and a look into what women contributed to WWE before the mid 2000s, so that you can really see that type of progression in that fight that they had to really push for some great content in WWE. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you soon.